Eddie Canistracci here. I'm back yet again, and this time to talk about the one and only Neil Young. Let me take these sunglasses off. I'm finally going to do an in-depth video about Neil Young. This has been a long time coming because he's one of my all-time favorite artists, especially this period that I'm about to tackle, his mid-70s period. That's what I think we should call this period. There's going to be a little controversy here, at least among some diehard Neil Young fans, because I am not just simply going through all the albums released during this period, because there was a lot of unreleased material that has since been released, and as a result, it puts this whole period in a whole new context. And it's a new context that I think we need to reappraise this period. We need to ditch the ditch. Yeah, stop using the term ditch trilogy, because it's meaningless now. All right, I always had some issues with the term ditch trilogy, even though a few times in the past I have said it. But I always kind of had my doubts about this. In case you're watching a very long Neil Young video about the ditch era and you don't know what the ditch trilogy is, it's essentially 3 albums that were released back in the 70s, Time Fades Away, On the Beach, and Tonight's the Night. It's these 3 albums that were released post-Harvest, which was a major success and Spawn Young's only #1 song, Heart of Gold. And the term ditch trilogy pretty much comes from this one comment, this one kind of throwaway line, a joke that Neil Young made in the liner notes of his Decade compilation from 1977. When discussing Heart of Gold, Neil Young said, "That song put me in the middle of the road. Traveling there soon became a bore, so I headed for the ditch." So he decided not to knock out a bunch of songs like Heart of Gold and capitalize on that success, and instead just did whatever he wanted to do. And he is making a little joke because he's playing off of the idea that it's a middle of the road song, like the work of the Eagles or James Taylor. A lot of critics and people might call that middle of the road country rock. He's simply making a reference to that. If he kept on knocking out stuff like Heart of Gold, he would be a middle-of-the-road artist. And he did not do that. So he's just making a little joke about how he drove into a ditch instead. Unfortunately, this is what happens, and especially in a lot of kind of, I would say, pretentious rock critic circles. They make a meal out of things like this. And they like putting things in certain packages, and they discovered something. They want to make things into trilogies and what have you. There's no ditch trilogy. There's no trilogy. These albums, the only thing they have in common is that Neil Young recorded all of them, and they were recorded in the mid-70s. I think there's this kind of misconception that I don't know, Tonight's the Night, for example. Yeah, it's a dark record, but it's not such a radical detour from what Neil Young was doing prior to Harvest. Even a few songs on Harvest, but prior to that, everybody knows This Is Nowhere, which is this really dark and gritty proto-grunge album, and that came out in 1969, and that had such dark, sludgy rock epics as Cowgirl in the Sand and Down by the River. Tonight's the Night, if anything, sounds like it's harkening back a little bit, but there's a lot of country stuff on that album as well, and we're going to get more into Tonight's the Night. But my point is, it's not like he did this radical turn, and unless you were if you were some casual kind of fan that only knew Heart of Gold and you only got into Neil Young because of Harvest, and I'm sure there was a lot of those, in 1972 and 1973. But if you were a hardcore Neil Young fan and you'd been with him since the first album. First album is a mix of country and rock songs, a little touch of psychedelia. So it's not like Lou Reed when he did Metal Machine Music. That's a ditch, all right? That's a goddamn musical ditch. If he had decided to pounce on the success of Heart of Gold and start to release more middle-of-the-road country pop albums, that would have been a detour. That would have been unlike Neil Young. That would have been like him going off on a new exit in a new direction. Instead, he did the opposite. He stayed the course. He just stayed on the road doing what he was always doing since the very first album. From his first album on, Neil Young just did whatever he wanted to do. Didn't care about the genres. He didn't think that way. Country, rock, pop, psychedelia, folk. He did what he wanted to do, and he wasn't going to do things just to be popular. That's not driving into a ditch. That's simply not selling out. Yes, Neil Young didn't sell out. And isn't that great? People made too much of a meal out of this little throwaway ditch line. And they kind of put these 3 albums together and try to make them a trilogy, when in fact, they are not. Each album is its own special, unique thing, and that's how we should approach them. I started to see the wheels fall off on this whole ditch trilogy nonsense a couple of years ago. Neil Young re-released 4 albums from this period. Yeah, 4 albums from this period. There were new remastered versions of Time Fades Away. Time Fades Away, which was an album that was out of print for many, many years, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that album specifically. In addition to that new remastered, re-released version of Time Fades Away, there was Tonight's the Night, and On the Beach, and Zuma. He was counting Zuma along with that air. Some Neil Young fans were saying, hey, should we call this a ditch quadrilogy? Is that how you say that? Quadrilogy? I'll tell you this, I always considered it a quadrilogy. Yeah, I mean, to me, Zuma felt like it was connected to those albums. It's the mid-70s peak Neil Young, you know? People start wondering, is there a quadrilogy now because Neil Young put out these 4 albums together? And then, shortly after that, he released an unreleased album, an album he never released from 1975. The album, actually, he was going to release, and then he released Tonight's the Night instead. Homegrown. So Homegrown was finally released. That stirred people up again, because now it was like, is it a quinology? Is that the term? When it's 5 things, a quinology? Maybe it's a ditch quinology. Okay, when we're getting into quinologies, maybe that's when it's time to just let it go. Ditch the ditch, all right? I'm making a hashtag right there, ditch the ditch. It's not a ditch trilogy. It's not a ditch quad trilogy. It's not a ditch quinology. It's none of these things. It's just a bunch of really awesome albums that Neil Young recorded in the mid-70s, each with its own thing going on, and each with its own sordid recording history. From 1973 to 1976, Neil Young recorded the best music of his life. That's what matters. That's what counts. And now we're going to get into it. We're going to get into what I consider to be Neil Young's greatest period. And I'm not the only one. Now, I know some people might say After the Gold Rush or Harvest, and I love both those albums. They're great. But to me, he was just warming up. To me, he took shit to the next level the following year after Harvest, with Time Fades Away and Tonight's the Night, both recorded in 1973. At least an early version of Tonight's the Night was recorded in 1973. And to me, he kept on going all the way until Chrome Dreams. Chrome Dreams, another aborted album that was released just this year, 2023. That's kind of the last piece of this puzzle. And the majority of that album was recorded in 76 and earlier. So really, this is the block. The block is 73 to 76. And this ain't a ditch. This isn't a ditch at all. It's actually an open road. It's the opposite of a ditch. To put everything in context, one missing piece I didn't have was, even though I've had separate albums that were included in this, I didn't own a copy of the Neil Young Archives Volume 2 until recently. A good friend of mine, Samuel Wetz, hooked me up. You should check out his radio show, Sam's Rockin' Metal Odyssey, on that metal station. I'll leave a link down below in the description. He hooked me up with the Neil Young Archives. I've just been listening nonstop to all this wonderful music that's in this collection, and it helped me really put everything in context. It helped me to put everything that we're going to be discussing, so all those albums that you saw in the thumbnail, I'm going to discuss in detail, while also discussing the sessions that led to those albums that you can hear excerpts from the Archives Volume 2, 1972-1976 collection, and you should definitely check that out. It's an amazing collection. Even on that collection alone, there's all this great music and a lot of great unreleased songs. It's a lot like Prince in the mid-80s. You had all these unreleased albums. Dream Factory, you had Camille, you had Crystal Ball. Eventually, this all became Sign of the Times. After his passing, a lot of that stuff was released, and it put everything in a new context for Prince. And God, what an amazing creative run that was. And this is a very similar period, very similar artists, actually. I think Neil Young's a lot like Prince in a lot of ways. Not just because they're amazing guitarists and eccentric personalities and geniuses, but they weren't always the best judge of what to release and what not to release. It was almost like they were overwhelmed by their genius. You know, there was just too much. A lot of times, a lot of great stuff didn't get released until later on, or it got released, but in a less impactful way. But we got it all now. like the Prince stuff, like Beach Boys Smile. We got most of it now. And now we can really dive into it, ditch to ditch, and just talk about Neil Young's amazing run during his greatest period as a songwriter and artist, in my opinion. To give a little preamble to Time Fades Away, he was using a new band of musicians he put together called the Stray Gators for Harvest, which included Ben Keith, wonderful pedal steel guitar player, and also Jack Nietzsche, the piano player for a lot of great rock music. Most famously, the Rolling Stones. He played on a lot of classic Rolling Stones songs. He played piano on Harvest. Jack Nietzsche also played with Crazy Horse on their debut album, 1971's Crazy Horse, which this is an important album to talk about right now, actually. This is really where this all begins, this journey, this musical journey we're going. This is the One Crazy Horse album featuring Danny Whitten. He was the main guitarist when Neil Young wasn't playing, and he was the main vocalist when Neil Young wasn't singing. Like, on this album, Danny Whitten is primarily, with a few exceptions, the lead vocalist, and it's great. It's a great album. This is a great, underrated album that I highly recommend it, especially if you're a fan of Southern rock and you like stuff like the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner and stuff like Neil Young and Crazy Horse. Well, this album is just good straight up Southern rock with a little splash of psychedelic rock thrown in spots. It gets a little trippy here and there, but for the most part, it's just good, solid, ballsy Southern rock. And Danny Whitten, he was a really talented guy. He had a great voice, great guitar player. He was a great frontman. Like, you feel like when you listen to this album, Crazy Horse might have took off in their own right with Danny fronting them. This guy, Danny, moved Neil Young as a singer and guitarist. But unfortunately, he was deep in a heroin addiction by 1972. As a result, Neil Young couldn't really use or Crazy Horse much. They played on a handful of tracks on After the Gold Rush, but on Harvest, the studio musicians or the Stray Gators. And after the success of Harvest, of course, Neil Young was going to go out on tour, and he used the Stray Gators, became his live backing band. And this would lead into Time Fades Away, the first album we're diving into. But before we dive into that album, let's give it a little context thanks to Neil Young Archives Volume 2. Yes, the first disc is entitled Everybody's Alone. Cool thing about this collection is all these individual discs, they're presented like albums in their own right. They have like an album's length of material, they have album covers, they have an aesthetic. There's 10 discs in all, and it's a great collection. This first collection is from material from 72 to 73, few things hanging over from Harvest, leading into songs that are going to make up Time Fades Away. You actually hear a couple rare studio versions of the Time Fades Away songs, plus you get to hear acoustic versions of what would become Last Dance, a song he originally called Monday Morning, and also LA. There's a great live acoustic version of LA where he does this really funny story beforehand, which is great. Highly recommend checking that out. So it seemed like after Harvest that Neil Young was kind of considering some of these songs, these Time Fades Away songs, to be studio recordings, and that this would probably be the follow-up to Harvest, a studio album. But he thought, fuck it, let's just go out, let's take these new songs out along with other popular songs that we'll be playing live, and then we could separate the new songs and put them together and make that the new album. And that album became Time Fades Away, released in 1973. Time Fades Away is my favorite Neil Young album. Now, is it a live album or a studio album? Well, obviously, technically, yes, it's a live album. These tracks are recorded live, but it's put together like an album. For one thing, like I mentioned, these are all new songs. These were new songs at the time that were not on any studio album. Ted Nugent did a similar thing the following decade with an album called Intensities in 10 Cities, where that album is comprised of all new songs, but recorded live that he did at various concerts. And what do you know? That's my favorite Ted Nugent album. So this must be a thing I like. All right, I guess I like these conceptual live albums. This is another thing where I think there was like kind of a false narrative being created. Because I remember in the early days of the internet where I was very intrigued by Time Fades Away because it was an out-of-print album that Neil Young held back famously because he didn't like how it sounded. It was never released on CD. Not until 2017, in fact, was when it was finally released on CD and digital format. This album definitely had a mystique for me. The first time I heard it was actually on YouTube. It always mesmerized me, not just because of the mystique of Neil Young Young holding back the album from being re-released, but just because of the material was so strong on it. So I would read up on it. I would read some like rock critics talk about how like this was a tour that went horribly wrong and people were upset because Neil Young didn't play any Harvest songs and he was just playing all this new stuff. Of course, now we know that's all bullshit. I'm not saying that Neil Young didn't have some issues personally while going on the tour, but another live album was released called Tuscaloosa, 1973. So this album, Tuscaloosa, is also with the Stray Gators, although it's the earlier incarnation, which had the great Kenny Buttrey on drums, who played on Harvest and on some classic Bob Dylan albums, and I talked about him in my Bob Dylan video. He would eventually be replaced on tour with Johnny Barbata, who plays on Time Fades Away. But Tuscaloosa is from an earlier leg when Kenny Buttrey was still in the band. Originally, Neil Young was calling this Time Fades Away 2. He was going to position this as a replacement to Time Fades Away, but then scrapped that idea. This shows that in addition to a couple songs that would be on Time Fades Away, they were including lots of Harvest songs. In fact, they play most of the songs you would expect them to play from Harvest. So they were actively playing Harvest songs along with the Time Fades Away material. Makes sense, Time Fades Away is only an 8-song album. Obviously, Neil Young and the Stray Gators played more than 8 songs live. So again, I think this is just like something just some bullshit critics made up because they just looked at the album and went, hey, he released an album for the Harvest tour and he didn't play any Harvest songs. Well, he did actually live. He played a bunch of Harvest songs. Not only that, as you can hear him during Tuscaloosa, between the crowd, he's very friendly. He's making jokes. He's in good spirits. He sounds like he's having a good time with the band. And even when they play a new song, he tells the crowd, don't worry, we're going to play an old song after this. Like, so this idea that he's like driving into a ditch, it's a bit of a false narrative. Yes, it sounds like Neil Young was being a professional, and then, because he's a very creative guy, he decides instead of just putting out the full concert, like a double live album, Harvest Live, instead he creates this conceptual album, Time Fades Away, which essentially is the follow-up to Harvest. Not just a live album, but this is the album after Harvest. This is his follow-up to Harvest. Even though it wasn't recorded in the studio, I consider it a studio album statement, if that makes any sense. This is a conceptual statement. The songs are amazing. They're arranged in a way, even how like the title track sets things off and Last Dance ends it. This is a proper fucking album. Time Fades Away, that title track comes in, great mixture of rock and roll and country, kind of honky-tonk rock and roll, kind of shit like the Rolling Stones were doing around Exile on Main Street. That great rootsy music that kind of blends the two together. And it's a great song. It's one of his greatest songs. I love Time Fades Away, Charges Through. You got Journey Through the Past, a beautiful piano ballad. Yonder Stands the Sinner. Love that song. A quirky, great mid-tempo rock song. Very catchy, very fun, great lyrics. Love that song. L.A., my second favorite song on the album. Of course, it nails what L.A.'s like. I love the lyrics. All I can say is, living in Los Angeles, this is probably the song that captures the vibe of L.A. more than anything else. This hazy, dark place that you need to escape from. You need to escape from L.A., but it's like the mafia. It drags you back in. And talk about like pre-grunge. Like, yeah, this is why he was called the Godfather of grunge. Songs like L.A., and especially the last one we're getting to. Love and Mine, beautiful piano song. Don't Be Denied, another one of the greatest Neil Young songs ever. Beautiful melodies and harmonies. This is like Lennon, McCartney, and Bob Dylan level writing, in my opinion. It's amazing. The Bridge, another beautiful piano ballad. Essentially, this album is comprised of hard rock songs and piano ballads. And of course, the big finale, the big masterpiece, 8 minutes and 47 seconds, Last Dance, one of the heaviest songs that Neil Young ever recorded. This is totally proto-grunge. This is my favorite song on the album, and it's beyond epic. Great guitar work from Neil, and it's just so dark and dirty and menacing. It sounds like the shit's really going down now. Like, this is like the last day on Earth. You wake up and it might be your last day alive. I'd be surprised if Danny Whitten wasn't on his thoughts when he wrote that song, because Danny Whitten did die in 1972 before this tour. So his shadow is hanging over this. He died of a drug overdose. Ironically, not heroin. He was trying to kick heroin, and he had an overdose of diazepam and alcohol. So he mixed diazepam and alcohol, and he had an overdose, and he passed away sadly in November of 1972. So his death definitely hangs over the material on this album, and even more so with the next album, which we're getting to now. Tonight's the Night, originally recorded in 1973. The majority of it, anyway. The original version, a lot of people don't know this. I think they think the official version that came out in 1975, I think they think that whole album is just the album that was recorded in 73. No, according to Neil Young, the original album, which we have not heard, it's actually not included on the archives. Most of the versions of these songs on the archives, volume 2, are the actual versions that were later reworked over the years and then released in 1975. But the original Tonight's the Night was apparently a rawer version. It was a more raw version with just 9 songs. It was a 9-song album, and 2 songs that were added later on at subsequent sessions were Lookout Joe and Borrowed Tune. In fact, Borrowed Tune was recorded in 74 during the On the Beach sessions, and they were included in 1975 when he decided to rework the album. Actually, throughout that whole period, between 73 and 75, Neil Young kept rearranging the album and adding different songs, so people have bootlegged different versions of this album with different track listings, but I don't believe anyone has the original raw 9-song version. If they do, I'd love to hear it. Comment and leave a link in that comment. This was with Crazy Horse. This is another thing. People later on act like Danny Whitten died. That was it. No more Crazy Horse until Neil Young put them back together with Zuma. Well, not only did Crazy Horse release other albums on their own without Danny Whitten before Zuma, Neil Young played with them before Zuma, because this is Crazy Horse. They called this band the Santa Monica Flyers, but it's Crazy Horse. It's the same lineup, in fact, that's on their first studio album from 1971. You got Billy Talbot on bass and Ralph Maleo on drums, so that's the classic Crazy Horse rhythm section, still to this day. But in addition, you have Jack Nietzsche again on piano and Niles Lofgren on guitars, who was the second guitarist on that first Crazy Horse album from 1971. So this is that band. This is Crazy Horse, but simply without Danny Whitten because he tragically passed away. So Neil Young's playing with Crazy Horse, all right? And they're just calling them Santa Monica Flyers. This right here is a Crazy Horse reunion, all right? So it's not Zuma. Zuma's great, and Zuma is a rebirth for personal reasons for Neil Young, which I'll get into when we get into the album. But in terms of Crazy Horse, this is the cathartic album. This is the album, not Zuma. This is the album where they're getting back together and they're working through the death of their friend and former bandmate, Danny Whitten. This is essentially Neil Young and Crazy Horse's Back in Black. It's very similar. Even has the stark in mourning cover. And that's one thing about Danny Whitten. I mean, just look at this guy. You notice from that picture, you notice how Neil Young looks a lot like how Danny Whitten looked with the sunglasses, the hair, the vibe. This whole idea is that this album is a tribute to Danny Whitten. So this is Neil Young and the boys playing for Danny Whitten, and especially the original version, the original 9-song version, which was just the tracks with this band. At the time, maybe it was too soon. Neil Young and the band wasn't ready to call the band Crazy Horse yet, so they called it Santa Monica Flyers. But come on, it's Crazy Horse. To me, that's another element that disrupts this whole idea that Zuma should not be connected with this because Zuma is a rebirth for the band and all that. The rebirth's right here. And this is him working through it. This is a very cathartic album. Although it's dark, but it's the band working through shit. Of course it's dark. Back in Black was darker than Highway to Hell. Yes, they lost their friend and bandmate. It was a dark album. Too dark for his record label. In fact, Neil Young had the right to release whatever albums he wanted. The label would have supported it. They simply discouraged it. And they did this a few times in the mid-70s where they would be like, yeah, Neil, you're a genius. You can release what you want, but I don't know about this one. I don't think the people that like Harvest are going to like this. I disagree. I think people would have loved it. Yeah, maybe some of those like posers and casual fans that just liked Heart of Gold wouldn't like it, but they were bound to be jumping off the Neil Young train anyway, because Neil Young wasn't that kind of artist. He wasn't a middle-of-the-road artist. But those fans that have been with Neil Young since the 3 albums prior to Harvest, they would have loved it. It would have been a classic Neil Young album released in 73. In fact, I think it would have had more impact than it did in 75. If you really want to hear an early version, check out a great live album that's also included in this archives collection, but also was released on its own. I bought it a few years back when it was first released on its own. Roxy, Tonight's the Night, live, 1973. Amazing live album, one of my favorite live albums. It was recorded at the Roxy on Sunset Boulevard, which is adjacent to the Rainbow Barn Grill, which used to be an old haunt of mine. They pretty much play all the songs, the original songs. Him and Crazy Horse, yeah, he calls it the Santa Monica Flyers, but come on, it's Crazy Horse. It's just the Crazy Horse with the 1973 lineup. They also include a song, Walk On, which is a pretty upbeat kind of song, yeah, and that would of course be on the next album that we're going to be talking about. So it shows that it wasn't all just doom and gloom during this period. And in fact, if you listen to Neil Young throughout this concert, he's cracking jokes, he's having fun, it's like a boozy good time. If anything, it's like a fun wake. And we're going to talk more about Tonight's the Night, track by track, when we get to the official release in 1975. But he shelved that. He shelved that original version, and he decided to go with this album instead, On the Beach. Most of this album was recorded in Neil's home studio in Broken Arrow Ranch. Broken Arrow Ranch is where he recorded some of the songs on Harvest. And it was this big ranch that Neil Young owned in California. And he recorded a majority of the songs from On the Beach there. Obviously, this album has its darker moments, but not nearly as dark as Tonight's the Night. And it sounds like he's trying to release an album that he thinks people might like a little bit better. Now, it's not a total concession. He's not like writing Heart of Gold style songs. Not yet, anyway. It's definitely a little more upbeat. Plus, I just think he's feeling a little bit more upbeat. I think he had this cathartic experience playing with Crazy Horse again and doing Tonight's the Night. That was like an exorcism along with Awake. And now he's moving on. Now he's walking on. I mean, that's actually one of the last tracks they play live at the Roxy Tonight's the Night is Walk On. Like, Walking On is kind of a refresh, rebirth. So there, Zuma's not the only rebirth. On the Beach is a rebirth. So he's already out of the ditch. Already out of the ditch. What do you know? Ditch the ditch. It's bullshit. But yes, there are some dark songs on this album as well, like all Neil Young albums. Come on, he's always sometimes upbeat, sometimes he's dark. He's a moody guy, Neil Young. On the Beach has a mixture of different musicians, including the Crazy Horse rhythm section and Ben Keefe coming back to do some amazing pedal steel. And this is one of my favorite Neil Young albums as well. All these albums I'm discussing are all my favorite Neil Young albums, and I put them all above Harvest and After the Gold Rush. And I put them above everything released afterwards, even though there were a lot of great albums. I love Rust Never Sleeps and Hawks and Doves and a lot of albums he released later on. But this period, all these albums are my favorite Neil Young albums. It opens up with Walk On, the strutting, fun, kind of funky rock soul song, very upbeat, just gives you a good feeling, leads into See the Sky, About to Rain, beautiful song, great electric piano. This is an older song that dates back to 71. It's got a nice mellow early 70s vibe. Revolution Blues, my favorite song on the album, love it. This is a great, dark, predatory rock song about the Manson family. It's kind of through the point of view of Charles Manson. At least that's my takeaway anyway. It's great. It really gives you that vibe. Like LA, the scorched, sinister landscape where bad things can happen around the corner. And oh man, it's an amazing song. Should have been used in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Great production. Reminds me of some of the stuff on the John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band album. The drums and bass, they have that kind of groove to it. Love it. For the Turnstiles, great hillbilly kind of folk song with a banjo. Love that song. Vampire Blues, dark but kind of fun blues song. And that's the thing, there's a lot of humor on this album. You even see it on the album cover. Although the second side is where shit gets dark, all right? First side's kind of fun with the exception of Revolution Blues, but the second side gets really dark. On the Beach, the title track, wonderful. One of my top 10 favorite Neil Young songs. Epic song. Kind of different from anything he would do before or after. I love the guitar tone. The guitar tone's amazing. Some of his best guitar work. York. Epic song, 7 minutes long. Love on the Beach. And then we have a wonderful folk song, Motion Pictures. Beautiful song. Another kind of burned out Hollywood Babylon kind of narrative. Great lyrics throughout this album. Love Motion Pictures. And then you have Ambulance Blues. Ambulance Blues, another one of my favorite Neil Young songs. The folk epic. Yeah, the folk epic on this album. It's 8 minutes and 57 seconds long. Kind of song that like Bob Dylan would have done in the mid-60s. And it's that level of songwriting. Great tragedy, great tragedy in his lyrics. He's one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century. So then we go back to the archives. Going back to the archives, and it's the old homestead. Now, these recordings are all throughout the same year, throughout 1974, and these sessions are primarily folk and country songs. And there's a lot of amazing songs on this. Frozen Man. I would have loved to hear Frozen Man with some kind of orchestration or just with a band. Like, he's doing all these intricate, really cool, almost jazzy parts on the song on the acoustic guitar. It's amazing. I mean, this is why Neil Young is my second favorite guitarist. Yeah, after Jimmy Page, who's my favorite, Neil Young's my second favorite guitarist. I've decided that, especially when I was listening to all this stuff. I was like, nah, it's Neil Young. Neil Young's my second favorite. Because like Jimmy Page, I equally love his acoustic guitar playing and his electric guitar playing. His electric guitar playing, and we'll get more into this when we get to Zuma, is kind of the obvious star. Like, yeah, that's what people are going to be talking about. But man, just listen to Frozen Man. When you just listen to the intricate stuff he's doing on the acoustic guitar and all these little melodies and stuff and licks, kind of like Jimmy Page, like it's just ear candy, just listening to Neil Young play an acoustic guitar. And now we're getting to Homegrown. Now, Homegrown's an album that really upsets the false Ditch Trilogy narrative. This album came very, very close to coming out in 1975. So close there was even an album cover. Yeah, there you go. That was actually the album cover that was planned. Neil was ready to put this baby out. And his record label was probably thrilled because this sounds like the kind of album they wanted him to record 2 years prior. Yeah, this sounds like it would have been a great follow-up to Harvest. So I'm sure by 1975 they were saying, hey, better late than never. Yeah, the tide started to turn a little bit on this kind of singer-songwriter, folky country rock. But there was still a little bit of that. So I do think this album would have been successful. It wouldn't have been Harvest, but it would have been his most successful album after Harvest if he had released it then. I'm sure it would have been. And I don't think he would have had a song as big as Heart of Gold. But I do think if released Try and Love is a Rose, I think could have been like crossover country hits. Love is a Rose. Beautiful song. Classic song. Like Paul McCartney and Bob Dylan, Neil can just write a song that sounds like an instant standard. Love is a Rose sounds like an instant standard. Like, wasn't that song always around? Overall, I think this album's stronger than Harvest. I think it's a more mature and darker Harvest. So I'm all about a more mature and darker Harvest. And the reason is, this is the breakup album. Yes, this is the breakup album. Zuma's the post-breakup album. This is the actual we're breaking up album. And yes, he was breaking up with his girlfriend at the time, actress Caroline Snodgrass. Caroline Snodgrass, hope I said that right, who was in the movie Diary of a Mad Housewife. She's the actress I assume he's singing about in A Man Needs a Maid. So he's been messing around with this woman for a while, and doesn't sound like it's a lot of fun being Caroline Snodgrass's boyfriend. That's all I can say, because Neil, for several years here, this woman is always causing him torment. A lot of romantic angst caused by Miss Snodgrass. Essentially, this is Neil Young's Blood on the Tracks, and it's interesting because both 1975 albums, hey, what was going on with these guys? What was going on with these scrappy folk guys with women breaking their hearts? Imagine if Bob Dylan was about to release Blood on the Tracks in 1975, and then last minute decides, no, don't want people hearing that. It's too personal. I don't want people hearing that. And he decides not to release it. And instead, he releases a scrapped album from him and the band from a couple of years earlier and released that instead. And he didn't release Blood on the Tracks for decades. Yes, imagine this scenario. He doesn't release it until 2020. Bob Dylan does not release Blood on the Tracks until 2020. Wouldn't that be insane? Wouldn't that seem crazy to you? Well, that's what Mr. Neil Young did. Yeah, an album that is not included officially in the Ditch Trilogy reflects the ditchiest move that Neil Young did during this whole time period. Not releasing Homegrown is a little akin to driving into a ditch, in my opinion. I do think it kind of diminished this album's impact. I think if this album was released in 1975, I do think people would hold it perhaps not quite on the same level of Blood on the Tracks, but it'd be in that conversation. I do think it's diminished because a handful of these songs ended up on other albums and they got spread out and they lost their original intent. You know, they weren't in the original context of this album, which is very conceptual. This is a real album. Yeah, just because he didn't release it until 2020, it doesn't make it less of a real album. It's still a 1975 album that Neil Young recorded and expressed very important things that he was going through. And it definitely should be part of the canon and the conversation. I think it's a masterpiece. Yeah, goddamn masterpiece. Starts off with Separate Ways. God, Separate Ways was a track that was not released until 2020. That is insane. I love how it starts off in like mid-note. It's like being dropped into a narrative. It's already been going on. It just has that intimacy. And Separate Ways really has all that power. You just feel the power of this love affair coming to an end. Neil knows how to play it and sing it for all its tragic worth. Try, the second track, a really wonderful, deceptively slight country song, but it's just like ear candy. The more you listen to it, you realize it's just a little perfect gem of a song. Same way Paul McCartney would knock out songs like this, especially during his like early solo career, like the McCartney album. Mexico's a great track. Love is a Rose, already talked about that. Beautiful song. Bittersweet, like this whole album. Early version of Homegrown, the title track, different from the version that would end up later on Stars and Bars and on other releases. This is my favorite version. I love this raw, scrappy version of Homegrown. It's awesome. Florida. Originally, I was not crazy about this track. It's a crazy experimental track in which there's a sound effect, which apparently is Neil Young, like tracing his finger around a glass, and they like put it up to a mic or something. And he tells this weird story about this glider guy that crashed in front of him. And it's like a little art piece. It's short. It's like 3 minutes long. And I start to realize lyrically it connected with Kansas, the next track, which I love. This lovely folk song of his, Kansas, where he has a lyric about a glider. So I think he's referencing the story that he's telling in Florida. Florida's just a little offbeat curveball, just a little weird gonzo thing, adds a kind of unsettling vibe to it. And I really love how it goes into Kansas. Kansas, an amazing song. Another song you would hear later in the sessions during Zuma. Great song, love that. We Don't Smoke It No More. Great kind of druggy, fun, stoner rock song. Kind of similar to some of the tracks you would have heard on Tonight's the Night. Love that. White Line, my favorite song on the album. Now, this is a track, he would do this version with Crazy Horse, this rocked out version, many years later on Ragged Glory. And that's a great version. But this original acoustic version, on a whole other level. I think this is much better. Like I said, I like that other version, but this is much better. Has Robbie Robertson actually playing a guitar along with him. And it's a wonderful, beautiful, bittersweet song. Just classic stuff. Vacancy. God damn it. My second favorite song on the album. Love Vacancy. Great rocker, kind of mid-tempo. Sounds a lot like World on a String, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. This is really a dark song too. Listen to those lyrics when he's singing about her vacant eyes and all that. And there's another one he didn't release this until 2020. Vacancy was not released until 2020. Ditch move, Mr. Young. Ditch move. Little Wing. Beautiful song. This would eventually end up on Hawks and Doves. It would actually open up that album. I love Little Wing. Not to be confused with the Jimi Hendrix song. Another amazing song that I love. This is a great little acoustic folk song. Very simple and straight from the heart. Star of Bethlehem ends this album. Now, this is a song that Neil was always dusting off and trying to use some way or the other. Eventually, it would be on Stars and Bars. And it's a great classic country song. Another song that sounds like an instant standard to me. Also, a possible hit, I think, if released in 1975, at least on the country charts. I think it's an amazing song. This album is a masterpiece. Obviously, you can hear how much I love it. And if you don't have Homegrown, you are missing out on one of the great albums of the 70s. But Neil Young did not release it. His original story of why he didn't release it, he had a party of some friends where he was playing a reel of Homegrown, and there was also Tonight's the Night was on that reel, and that album came up afterwards, and when he heard it, he was like, that Tonight's the Night album is really great. Maybe I should release that instead. So he kind of used that as an excuse to not release Homegrown, because I think Homegrown just struck too much of a nerve. It was just a little too personal for him. Or maybe, like I said, if there was any ditch move during this period, that was the ditch move, because obviously Homegrown was the type of album that his label would have liked him to release. And instead, he's making them release Tonight's the Night. The label was like, hey, you sure about this, Neil? You know, we weren't crazy about this album the first time. And Neil was like, he made them do it. He made them release Tonight's the Night. And I'm glad he did, because it's a masterpiece. Hey, I think he should have just released this in 1973 and then released Homegrown in 75, because that's how he recorded them, and that would have made a lot of sense. Now we are talking about the official 1975 release version. Actually, I would say objectively his greatest album. Like, if I was to give anyone a Neil Young album, Tonight's the Night's the album I would give him, because it kind of covers it all. It's kind of like his White Album, because like the White Album, not only does it have a similar kind of dark edge to it, but it's eclectic and there's all these different sides, especially the 75 version, the official version. It shows a lot of different sides. It's a tour de force album, and for a very long time, it was my favorite Neil Young album until Time Fades Away supplanted it. I guess if you're not counting Time Fades Away because it was recorded live, then I guess this is my favorite Neil Young album. This is my favorite Neil Young studio album anyway. The majority of this was recorded in 73, but the songs were tweaked and retooled over the years, and he added a couple songs that were recorded later, like Lookout Joe was one of the songs he added later, and Borrowed Tune. Borrowed Tune especially sweetens up the album a little bit. It's alright, I like the song. It's a nice little piano ballad that takes from the Rolling Stones' Lady Jane. It has a similar chord progression. Neil gives a little shout out to the Stones because of it. Title track, Tonight's the Night, I think possibly could have been a hit in 1973 when first released. I think that's a catchy rock song. Yeah, it's a different audience than the Heart of Gold audience, but, you know, people that like the Rolling Stones and Grand Funk Railroad, shit like that, I think they would have loved Tonight's the Night. Really catchy, great rock song, and this is pure Neil Young and Crazy Horse. I don't care if he calls it the Santa Monica Flyers. It's Neil Young and Crazy Horse. Speaking Out's a great, tipsy, drunken country rock song. Love it. World on a String, my favorite Neil Young song. So there you go. Now you know my favorite Neil Young song. I love World on a String. And this version, that Roxy live version's pretty great too. I love them both. I remember when I first heard the song was on the Unplugged, Neil Young Unplugged from the early 90s. I always loved the song, even back then. But especially when I heard this electric version, this studio electric version from this album, man, just 2 minutes and 27 seconds. It kind of encompasses everything I love about Neil Young. You know, you got the electric kind of grungy guitar line during the verses, but then in the chorus it has this pedal steel and it gets all country-ish. Oh man, I love it. It's the ultimate Neil Young song in my opinion. You know, it's both the rock and the countryside. It's a perfect song. I love it. Borrowed Tune, already talked about that. Come On Baby, Let's Go Downtown. Originally a song that was on that Crazy Horse album from 71, and it was called Downtown on that album. The studio version was called simply Downtown, and Danny Whitten was the lead vocalist. This is from a earlier performance, actually. It was from 1970, recorded live at the Fillmore East. That album was subsequently released decades later. This version's called Come On Baby, Let's Go Downtown. It's a great live version. You hear Danny and Neil singing in harmony, and their voices sound great. Danny's very prominent on this, so that's the guy that has kind of like the hillbilly-ish voice. That's Danny Whitten, and that's what he sounds like. It's a great track, and yeah, it fits the vibe of the album, even though it was recorded earlier. And this album is a tribute. Like I said, this is the Back in Black for Danny Whitten, so it makes sense that they would include this track. Mellow in My Mind, great, slow, kind of druggy country rock song. Love it. Roll Another for the Road, kind of similar to the last one, another kind of druggy, slow song. I'm sure this is the kind of stuff the label wasn't crazy about. Albuquerque, man, love Albuquerque. Another one of my favorite songs on the album. Slow, offbeat, I guess you'd call it a country ballad. It's kind of a just very Neil Young-esque country ballad. Man, I can't believe this song wasn't used in Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. feels like a missed opportunity. But amazing song. I love how when he starts singing about the food he's eating at the diner, he likes his ham, and it just puts you there. And I've been to Albuquerque once, and this song captures that kind of hazy, weird, deserty Albuquerque vibe. A lot of Neil Young songs are like that. He takes from the folk tradition or the country folk tradition of singing about places he's visited and places he's been and the emotional connection he has with these places. New Mama, great song, great acoustic version. The original version, which you could hear going back to the Tuscaloosa live album, there was an electric version of New Mama, which I thought was great. Actually, I think I like that electric version even better. This version's good too. I like the acoustic version. Look Out Joe, song he actually did with the Stray Gators and not Crazy Horse, but it sounds like a Crazy Horse song. It flows with the album, and I think it was a good addition. Tired Eyes, great song, one of the best songs on the album, in my opinion. Great, gonzo, weird, talking blues country song, a little Dylan-esque. I love it, love the chorus, and one of his greatest songs. And then of course we wrap up with Tonight's the Night Part 2, which is essentially a reprise, a great jam. I would say this one's a little funkier. First one's a little more rockin', this one's a little funkier, but it's great, and it's a great way to wrap up this masterpiece of an album. How could you not love Tonight's the Night? If you don't love Tonight's the Night, you don't love rock and roll, you don't love music, and you definitely don't love Neil Young. So what are you doing watching a Neil Young video? Anyway, keep watching. So in 75, after not releasing Homegrown and releasing Tonight's the Night, Neil Young did not stop by any means. He was still in his creative zone, not in a ditch at all, but instead about to reach another high mark during this great songwriting and recording run of his. On that Archives box set, there's a disc called Doom, which is essentially the Zuma sessions. Yes, so we'll be getting to Zuma now. This album is probably the closest to what the sessions actually yielded, and there's only 2 additional songs that were not part of these sessions. And this is Neil Young with Crazy Horse again. The band he was recording with on Tonight's the Night. Well, he's back with them again, except for no more Jack Nietzsche. We don't have any piano in this. This is more of a stripped-down 4-piece band. The new guitarist is the rhythm guitarist Frank Pancho San Pedro. Great rhythm guitarist, and this is the new Crazy Horse now, and this will be Crazy Horse for a long time. But the real star of the show, no disrespect to Crazy Horse, great backing band, but this is Neil Young's greatest statement as a guitarist, in my opinion. Tonight's the Night, I think, is his greatest studio album statement, but I think this is his greatest statement as a lead guitarist, and I'm not alone. A lot of people talk up Neil Young's guitar work on Zuma. It's called Zuma for the same reason why that disc in the Archives was called Doom. It was recorded at Neil Young's producer's home, David Briggs, who produced a lot of Neil Young's albums. His house was in Point Doom in Malibu. So this album was recorded there, and it has that vibe. It's got actually more of a beachy vibe than even On the Beach, in my opinion, but it also has the vibe of highways and mountains and Los Angeles and clouds and sky and sun and love and the past and the future and the present. It's an amazing album, Zuma. In fact, Zuma is my second favorite Neil Young studio album, or third overall, if we're counting Time Fades Away. And it's a masterpiece, another masterpiece. I absolutely adore this album. It is one of the greatest hard rock albums ever recorded. Probably, I would say, Neil Young's purest album. Just a pure and perfect hard rock album. There are 2 folky songs, which are from prior sessions that he threw on this album to kind of give it a little diversity. But for the most part, this is a straightforward hard rock album and very catchy, very melodic, lots of hooks. Great vibe. This album has a great vibe. Again, some people say, oh, well, this shouldn't be connected with the Ditch period because it's like a new rebirth, and it is a new rebirth, but almost every album during this period was a rebirth. Kind of every Neil Young album is a rebirth. He's kind of always rebirthing. But, it has darker moments. I mean, Cortez the Killer's on this, all right? Is that an upbeat song? No, that's a pretty dark and itchy song. After breaking up with Caroline Snodgrass, this is like, hey, now I'm single. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to rock out with the boys. Don't have to call my woman afterwards. She's out of the picture now. I can just have fun, play all night long. It's a celebration of life and freedom. Freedom, like the bird, the danger bird on the cover. And it sounds kind of menacing, and Danger Bird is kind of a dark song, but it's also a liberating song. His wings are turned to stone but he could still fly away. It was like his spirit animal was Danger Bird. And ultimately, I think this is an album about exploration and freedom. Opens up with the great Don't Cry, No Tears. Really catchy, almost kind of Stonesy hard rock song. Love it. Danger Bird is the second track. That's epic. That's my second favorite song on the album. Proto-grunge, yeah, you would say proto-grunge. I would say this is the second greatest guitar work, lead guitar work Neil Young has ever done. The sounds he gets out of his electric guitar, this is like next level. This is beyond rock playing. Like some people might listen to Neil Young and his playing, his jagged, loose kind of freeform style might sound sloppy to them, but they might not be used to listening to jazz and fusion. And I hear a lot of jazz actually in this guitar soloing. It's just these bursts and waves of emotion and the way he's bending the strings and the sounds he's getting out of it. This is kind of shit. Like I can imagine if Jimi Hendrix was alive and he heard Danger Bird, he would have saluted Mr. Young. He would have been like, man, you fucking took that shit to the next level. Danger Bird's amazing. Some of the greatest guitar soloing you'll ever hear in your goddamn life. Then you got Part of My Heart, nice little acoustic song. Got some of those Crosby, Stills, and Nash guys singing back up on that. Pretty song. It's nice for a little change. Looking for a Love, that's the hey, I'm single, I'm going out, I'm gonna get laid, I'm gonna have a good time song. It has a euphoric quality. Just love the guitar melodies, the backing vocals from Crazy Horse. Great song, love it. Barstool Blues, my third favorite song on the album. Awesome track, only 3 minutes, but man, it makes such an impact. A lot of pathos, a lot of emotion. This is a song I could kind of hear on Tonight's the Night. I feel like it's him thinking about past friends, past relationships. Like the song before, Looking for a Love, is early in the night when you're having fun at the bar and it's all good and it's all moving forward. But then you get a little sad later in the wee hours, a few drinks in, an old song comes on the jukebox and you think about people that are no longer there in your life. That's Barstool Blues in my opinion. Perfect way to end the first side. Stupid Girl, another song about him, I think, thinking back to Miss Snodgrass and thinking about how she's a stupid girl. And then you got Drive Back. Drive Back is kind of, I think, the flip side to LA, the song LA. Like now he's driving back to LA because now he's single and he's off the ranch for a bit and he wants to have some fun. But it's kind of dark and dirty and dangerous. Great song, love it. Cortez the Killer, one of Neil Young's most well-known and acclaimed songs, as it should be. It's a masterpiece. My favorite song on the album, one of my favorite Neil Young songs, and I think the greatest guitar work he ever did. And man, his solos are on a whole other level. Everything I said about the Danger Bird solos apply to the Cortez the Killer solos. And the song's brooding and dark and about the explorer and imperialist Hernan Cortez. First half of the lyrics about him conquering for Spain. He's conquering Mexico and the Aztecs, and it's talking about their culture and how it was a great culture, but now they're being conquered by this European imperialist, and it seems to be a historical song for the most part. But then there's that last verse. The last verse is very interesting, where it shifts point of view, and he's singing about a woman again, a woman off in this other land, and about a distance, this distance between him and a woman. So I think, again, it's kind of about Snodgrass. Even when he sings in a historical perspective, and he would do this a lot. He would do this on Pocahontas, where it starts off with being a historical song, but then in the last verse, it's about him, and he's bringing it back to him. And I think that's very interesting. And I think Neil Young, in his mind, the political, the historical, the personal, it was all intertwined, kind of like Jean-Luc Godard, the film work of Jean-Luc Godard, like Pro Le Fou, where he's sidestepping, sometimes within a single scene in the movie, the political and the personal. And I think that's how it worked in Neil Young's mind. He was thinking about Cortez the Killer, and maybe it was a metaphor, people conquering each other, and he started thinking about that, and then that makes him think about what happened between him and Snodgrass. So even the political comes back to the personal, and you hear it in his guitar solos. Those guitar solos, it's the blues. He's lamenting this love lost. So even this song, a historical song, is really not so much a historical song. It's what makes Neil Young's songwriting so fascinating, especially during this period. The lyrics on this album and then Chrome Dreams, I think, are the finest lyrics he ever wrote. Amazing stuff and an amazing song. And then it ends with Through My Sails, which is another one of those earlier folk songs, which he has Crosby, Stills, and Nash doing the backing vocals. I like it. The only thing, maybe Zuma Would have been even better than Tonight's the Night if maybe instead of those two acoustic songs, he used a couple of the rock songs that he didn't use from the Zuma sessions that were on Dune. For example, there is an electric version of Pocahontas with the band, and this actually predates that acoustic version, the very famous acoustic version that would appear on a lot of subsequent albums. So interesting that this full band version of Pocahontas seems to be, at least according to the archives, seems to be the first recorded version of the song. And it's great. I do prefer that later acoustic version, but this version's still great too. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, wow, imagine if Cortez the Killer then went into Pocahontas. Thematically, going from Cortez the Killer to Pocahontas, I think that could have been even more powerful. So as great as Zuma is, there might have been possibly an even better Zuma. But hey, regardless, it's great. Both Zuma and that Doom disc in the archives are great. If you're a hard rock fan, what are you doing not owning Zuma? And this kind of in a way is a peak. He kind of peaks. He has like one more great session of songs that he records. He records in a single night in 1976. So this is kind of the epilogue to Zuma. He records a bunch of acoustic songs. A lot of these songs are songs he had already written and they had popped up on a few other sessions beforehand. And he was going to release this shortly after in 1976. He was thinking of releasing this, but the label said, hey, it just sounds like a demo. They weren't sure about it. So again, this was another project that he shelved. Kind of. It's a little complicated. But essentially, this was released many years later in 2017 as Hitchhiker. It's an amazing collection of acoustic songs, solo, just Neil Young on acoustic guitar, and it just shows what a genius he was at this point. This guy could not write a bad song at this period. This is the version of Pocahontas that he would use later, that you would hear on Rust Never Sleeps, and it's amazing. Hitchhiker is a song that would show up many decades later on the Denoise album in an electric, reworked way, but this original acoustic version I think is even stronger. Campaigner is a great song. Love that line about even Richard Nixon has soul. A great early acoustic version of Powderfinger. Rust Never Sleeps version, the electric version on Rust Never Sleeps of Crazy Horse, I think is even stronger. But man, this acoustic version's great, and it's just such amazing lyrics. One of Neil Young's greatest storytelling songs. I love Powderfinger. So many great songs on this album, so I highly recommend it. It's a great album to listen to in the morning. There's a few more sessions that are collected in the Look Out for My Love 75 to 76 disc on the archives, and they include a few more tracks of Crazy Horse that were recorded at Broken Arrow Ranch, and they include Like a Hurricane. Yes, the classic version of Like a Hurricane that would end up on Stars and Bars. Another one of his greatest guitar solos ever. So much great guitar work on that song. Love Like a Hurricane. Also, a lot of love. A surprisingly poppy song, especially with Crazy Horse. To do with Crazy Horse, that would later end up in There Comes a Time. Look Out for My Love. Great track, which would end up on both Chrome Dreams, the aborted Chrome Dreams album, and There Comes a Time, Look Out for My Love. A song that I think if he had released a few years earlier, could have been a hit. Had a little bit of that Harvest vibe that people like so much. And he would record some stuff with Stephen Stills, and that would be the Stills Young Band. That would come out as Long May You Run, which is my least favorite of the material that he was doing during this period. But I'll blame that on Stephen Stills, bringing down Neil Young a drop. A lot of the great tracks that were on Hitchhiker and these later Broken Arrow Ranch sessions with Crazy Horse, Like a Hurricane, and Look Out for My Love, and a couple other tracks that were left over from Homegrown in 1977, put them all together and had another album he was about to release called Chrome Dreams. Chrome Dreams is another legendary aborted Neil Young album. Man, I love Chrome Dreams. Chrome Dreams is another amazing album. If he released this in 1977, 1977, maybe it wouldn't have had a major impact, but I think it's the kind of album that a few years later, people would go back to and say, hey, that's one of Neil Young's best albums. Let's just look at the track listing. Let me just read you the track listing from Chrome Dreams. Opens up with Pocahontas, one of his greatest songs. I love Pocahontas so much. Starts off historical, but then ends with the line about him and Pocahontas and Marlon Brando. Love it. Will to Love, that's another amazing song that he recorded during this period. where he's actually through the point of view of a salmon. Yeah, it's a point of view of a salmon going upstream, but I think it's like a metaphor for love and copulation. It's a trippy song. I love it. Almost sounds like something that could have been on his first album, actually. Star of Bethlehem, still trying to do something with that great song. Like a Hurricane, this would have been the first time he attempted to put this on an album, and showing that it was mixing the acoustic songs, the electric songs. Too Far Gone, a wonderful song that would show up years later on the Freedom album. Great little bittersweet country song, gem of a song. Another song that sounded like it could have been a crossover country hit. Love that song. Hold Back the Tears, and more stripped back early version than the one that would end up on Stars and Bars. Homegrown, the same one that would end up on Stars and Bars. I like it, but I like the original Homegrown better. Captain Kennedy, amazing song that would later end up on Hawks and Doves. It's an amazing folky country song. That's another song about a historical figure. Love it. String Man, a song I first heard on that Unplugged performance in the early 90s. This was a live recording from the Hammersmith in London. That was part of another live album that was released and part of the Archives collection. Sedan Delivery, an early, slower version with Crazy Horse that I think is even better than that faster version that would be on Rust Never Sleeps. Yeah, I actually like the slower version better. I think it's got a little more meat to it. I love it. Powderfinger, that stripped back acoustic version. And Look Out for My Love, a great way to wrap up the album. I actually think it has more impact as a last track than later on There Comes a Time. Yeah, amazing album. I love Chrome Dreams, another one of my favorite Neil Young albums. I don't care that he didn't release it. I'm still counting it, even though there's some crossover of some of the earlier albums that didn't get released. He didn't release it in 1977. This is another one he held back. Didn't release it until this year, 2023. He finally released it. This album, a lot of it was used for American Stars and Bars and There Comes a Time. Both good albums released in 1977 that I do like. But I think Chrome Dreams has more impact. It has more impact together, those songs all on that album, than spread out between those two albums. But how even a few of the songs from Chrome Dreams would even go on to Rust Never Sleeps and Hawks and Doves, showing you how prolific he was during this great period. This was his last great wave, and I kind of feel like Chrome Dreams is a great document to sum up this era. So there you go. Do you think it's a ditch? Nah, I don't think you think it's a ditch anymore. It's simply Neil Young's greatest run of songs he ever did, his great period. It's his great period from the mid-70s, and all these albums that I discussed you should own and you should listen to and you should get lost in them. They're those kind of albums. They're albums you can get lost in. Anyway, if you like this video and subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you for spending so much time listening to me talk about one of my favorite artists, Neil Young, and many of my favorite albums ever recorded. What a great run. The sun's going down, and I'm going to have myself a drink and listen to Chrome Dreams again. God, what a great album. I'm so glad they eventually released that. As always, I'm Eddie Canistracci, and rock on.